Hello, friends. How are you today? Guess where I am? I'm in my RV and we're traveling across the country interviewing the most fascinating guests. I put up a new banner behind me. I don't know if you're on YouTube, would you come and find us at HIM4Her Radio, Women's Hot Topics? And it says inspiring women to live victoriously, because that's what this show is all about. Allowing women to live victoriously in Christ. So I'm so happy you guys are on. And today we got a tough topic. Today's topic is called Under Pressure, Youth Mental Health. And I'm with one of my favorite counselors in the entire world, Mr. Todd Mulliken. Todd, thank you for coming on with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Shug.
I love it that we're able to Zoom. Doesn't matter where we are in the whole United States. And Todd is such a wonderful guy. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Todd has been married to his beautiful wife for 33 years, and they have 3 married daughters and 3 wonderful sons-in-law. He's a licensed professional clinical counselor and owner of Mulliken Counseling Center in Edina, Minnesota. And I hear it's a little chilly in Minnesota right now. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks so much, Shug. I really appreciate that.
I thought I'd tell you, I'm looking at palm trees right now. Not sure what your view is, but it's pretty nice.
Okay, love is not jealous. I got to remember that. Okay, love is not jealous.
Yeah, well, and you know what? People in warm weather need Jesus too. That's what I figure. He has been doing his practice over 30 years of counseling individuals, couples, and families. He's just got a vast of experience and information. And psychology faculty in Minneapolis College, Metropolitan State University, and Inver Hills Community College. He's the author of 4 books, and I want you guys to look these up because they're awesome books. I've read over half of them. And he's an author of 4 books and a speaker on a variety of mental health issues. You can find him at toddmulliken.com, and I'm going to spell that for you. Plus, we're going to have that up for you to take a look at if you're on YouTube. It's TODD, Todd, and then Mulliken, MULLIKEN.com. And again, Todd, thank you for coming on. We got a tough topic today.
We do. Thanks for addressing it, though.
You know, it came on the news, on the national news several weeks back about the crisis that our youth are going through under pressure. And I thought, well, as women and men, we need to talk about this through the lens of Christ. We don't want to talk about it just nationally like on the news. We want to talk about what's God's opinion on this? How can we start healing hearts? And what does this look like? And why is this topic now? Well, the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory sent out a 2021 advisory for our youth on mental health. It's either from the pandemic, it's doubled. 140,000 kids have lost caregiver loved ones, such as a parent or a grandparent. Suicide attempts are up 51% for adolescent girls this year. Between social media, Instagram, they say that it's harmful to teens, that it's not allowing them to be raised in a healthy environment. And the pressures that kids have today, sexual identity, school shootings. I mean, there's just so much stuff going on. I don't know how the youth today are going to be able to navigate it, but we got a guy on board with us who can help guide us in that. That's the Lord and Todd. So, Todd, let me ask you, how has the pandemic impacted mental health in kids?
I think the word I find myself saying quite a bit, Shug, is magnified. You know, it's really magnified things. So if an adolescent we know or a kiddo we know has battled some anxiety in their story, boy, it's just gotten louder, right? The fears, the what if thinking, you know, the feeling isolated, of depression. You know, the same with depression. Depression's a lot noisier for kids now and adolescents. The low energy, the apathy, the lack of interest in activities, you know, everything's being shut down. So a lot of times their bodies shut down. And so what we're seeing, regardless of their mental health history, Shug, is just things becoming more magnified. Even with the third most common mental health issue, which is ADHD, you know, we're seeing, you know, increased numbers of folks that are increasingly more distracted and more irritable and more agitated. And so it's really been hard and it's been chronic. You know, it's one thing if it was, you know, 2 or 3 months and we see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's been so long, you know, and kids have had to endure a lot over the last couple of years. It's been so hard.
Mm. And the parents too. I mean, you know, the challenges of juggling, how can I keep my children healthy during this crazy time that we're living in? I'm sure that you get a lot of parents that approach you as well.
Yeah, in a perfect world, which we don't live in, you know, the leaders in the home, the parents, would try to be kind of working on their own mental health stuff, right? Try to make sure as they best they can is try to make their, make sure their rudder is solid, and they're just trying to navigate the waters enough so that their kids can try to live as normally as they can in spite of the situation. So we want to make sure we're honest with our kids, but we want to make sure as parents we're not putting something on them. In other words, if I battle anxiety myself, Shug, and I'm really nervous about all the aspects of the pandemic, and I'm really frightened, and I'm maybe overcorrecting a little bit because of my own fear, my kid's going to pick that up in the mail, and it's going to be louder for them. So yeah, the best news is for those parents out there, myself included, we just need to do the best we can to be very present in our faith and know that God's still on the throne. And while we're navigating all this stress, we still know that some of the basics are still true in terms of that we're loved, accepted, and approved by God. And how do we use that contentment that Christ has in us in spite of the delicacy of all the pressures we're feeling? So I think it's good. Kids sometimes don't listen to us as parents, but they eventually imitate us, right? So how do we navigate that as parents right now? Because the kids are going through so much. And,
you're right on when you say, they're going to imitate what your reaction is. What is your knee-jerk reaction, friends, as a parent when all of these difficulties come up, or you see new things on the news, or you're more aware of what's going on social media with your kids, or your kids are being bullied, what's mom and dad's knee-jerk reaction? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But what do you think, Todd, are the most common mental health issues being exhibited by kids today?
So anxiety is still the loudest and still the most common. And so that's been magnified by about 50% greater likelihood. And so remember, the main symptoms of anxiety are excessive worry, restlessness, then just feeling keyed up and on edge. So they spend a lot of time with what if thinking, well, what if this happens? Or what if I do this and this doesn't work out? And what if this person thinks this way about me? And so their what if house is very noisy. And so that's just been exacerbated because anxiety, Shug, is louder with apprehension. In terms of when there's a fear of the unknown, anxiety is louder. There's been so much unknown with COVID, we're kind of learning as we go with any of these kind of issues that pop up. So it's been a lot of intense anxiety that's been magnified. And then the second most common is depression. And sometimes what happens without knowing it is we have a kid that we know or an adolescent we know that is anxious naturally. They're more anxious now. But what happens is the body eventually, after having so much anxiety, Shug, it kind of shuts down. Does that make sense? It has kind of an emotional hangover. So then they're more vulnerable to some of those depressive episodes where they're just really feeling flat, lack of interest. The big word I'm using with most of the adolescent students I'm seeing right now is apathy. That's really what I'm seeing a lot of, Shug, is apathy. So depression is second highest, anxiety is first highest. Depression can be, if you will, Shug, as mild as low energy and as severe as suicidal thinking, right? So, and in between are 8 other symptoms like what we call, psychomotor retardation. It's just hard to get going, fatigue, lack of interest in activity. So a lot of depression's around energy. And when the energy is really low, for example, you got a kiddo that's 15, that's an extrovert, and they've been kind of shut down, right? They can't connect as much. They can't be on the go as much. They're kind of atrophying emotionally. So they're struggling. Other symptoms are overeating, undereating, oversleeping, undersleeping, excessive guilt. That's really the first cousin of depression, when we're really pouring on a lot of guilt thoughts and feelings, and then feelings of worthlessness and helplessness. So depression typically comes in episodes. So if you have a kid that hasn't had a depressive episode ever, but they're having one now, we just want to know, hey, is there a family history of that? How do we pay attention to that? Does my mom had that issue, or my cousin I know has that issue. Now I'm seeing it in my 14-year-old for the first time.
Is a lot of that genetic?
It is. It really is. And typically with any mental health issue, Shug, it's the combination of genetic markers as well as life experiences. So once in a while can be just genetic. Once in a while can be just our experiences. but most of the time it's a interaction between two. So that's what we see the most, because not all kids that grew up in the same home have the same type of emotional issues 20 years later, right? So some of it is the genetic sensitivities that each person has.
I like the word that you said. You said atrophying emotionally. And I think it's probably happening. All these kids staying at home, they're not able to interact like they should as children and, run through those roles and those practices of human relationships. As a parent, what can you do to help strengthen that?
Well, as best as we can, the good news is, there's surges of COVID and then it gets a little quieter. And so then whatever activities they weren't in, now they're getting back into. We just want to engage in that. And if you will, we want to come off as normal as we can, not because we want to stick our head in the sand about the pandemic. It just means usually, whatever school system you're in, whatever church system you're involved in, they'll have regulations and things to protect the kids as best as they know how. So we just want to make sure our kids are still engaging in the levels that they can participate in, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that the strengths they do have that have been quieted right now, that they're still able to get back into those areas. Because what happens, if they get out of it a little bit and they get a little tired and flat and maybe a little anxious and maybe more apprehensive, they might not want to get back into those things. So sometimes parents have to do, some encouraging to get them back into those lanes, the focus of strengths that help them become re-energized and just a more healthy emotionally and spiritually.
So as a parent, let's say you see your kid starting to slump into that atrophying type of situation. I mean, would you say it's fair enough to say, okay, I recognize this in you, and I think all social media is off, computers are off, we're going to go outside, we're going to spend some time in nature. Does it help to pull them out of their day-to-day and give them new stimuli?
Yeah, each situation's so different, right? It really is. There isn't a one-size-fits-all here. We have to know how has God created each of our kids uniquely, right? What's going to work best for them? So if I've got a quiet kid that really generally loves one or two close friends and they've been shut down with that, I don't want to say they can't talk to that person until they get their homework done. In my opinion, I want to make sure they still are plugging in, but I got to lean on more. What are we going to do here for a consequence with the homework or with whatever? If I've got a kid that's really, bringing it back and forth and they're really, going at it toe to toe and they have lots of friends buzzing around, maybe my interactions and the discipline is the same in terms of the consequences, but how we go about it, Shug, is different based on the temperament of the kid. We really want to bring out their best, have natural consequences, meet them where they're at, but know that we're paying attention and we're for them, we love them, we want the best for them. Here's what we're thinking is best to do in the situation, so that the kids know they're being led, but they're also being heard.
Is it okay to acknowledge to the child that you're starting, and especially adolescents are old enough to understand mental health, that you maybe are concerned that there might be an issue?
Yeah, and again, you may have heard me say this phrase, how do we be honest with our kids without putting something on our kids? Mm-hmm. If I've got a 17-year-old that hasn't really had much mental health issues and they have their first depressive episode, but I myself have depression, I'm not going to sit my kid down for an hour and a half and tell them about my long history of depression, but I might say, hon, I've gone through that myself recently, or, I've had that battle in my history too. It's been hard, so I resonate with what you're going through. What can I do to help you here? Here's what I do, but what do you think for you? We're creating interactions with a 17-year-old, not interrogations. We're having joint decisions. We're leading as parents, but we're creating interactions, right? So the first step for sure, because again, Shug, what we do know in general, if that is, a 15-year-old or whatever has, crippling panic attacks or has some anxiety that's significant, more often than not, one of the parents has that worry gene themselves, or really they've been masking it in different ways that maybe haven't been healthy. boy, it's always good if a parent can say, hey, I gotcha. I go through that myself, so I really resonate with your worry. I hear you. Does that make sense? So I think it's really good to have that be our first move if we do battle some of that stuff ourselves, so they know they're not in it alone, and they know we're not just throwing stones emotionally. We're really understanding where they're at a little bit.
I think too, what I see, especially in my ministry, is drug use is prevalent in America, alive and well, and it starts early. Is it a little bit easier to identify when it's a drug use mental health issue versus just a psychological genetic one?
Great point. It is. And really one of the things that's been really helpful in our treating of people, Shug, is realizing that both mental health and chemical health are very what we call co-occurring disorders, right? So if you have a 15-year-old in your house that has some anxiety and they're starting to drink excessively, the drinking might become a co-occurring problem with the anxiety. In other words, they're drinking to get away from the way they're thinking. On the other hand, you can have somebody that has, addictive family, but they've been sober for 20 years, and one of their kids has ADHD, and they have the impulsive type of ADHD. Well, there's a 50% likelihood that they could have a vulnerability to some type of chemical addiction because they have that impulsivity. Some addicts are very fire ready aim, right? They're just impulsive with their use, and the addiction is more on the receiving pleasure in the pleasurable parts of their brain. So that's why there's such a high comorbidity, we call it, between ADHD and substance abuse. So yeah, they're hand in hand. Mental health issues and substance abuse issues go hand in hand often.
And that's so frustrating. From one use to another, how do you approach mental health in a friend who possibly is defensive and or paranoid?
Yeah, I think I find myself saying quite a bit to people, how do I create an interaction, not an interrogation? How do I let that friend in versus taking it out on them? So it doesn't mean we have to talk like therapists to each other, but we can say, I love you, I'm for you, and I just noticed you've been really, really worried and scared, and I'm worried about you, but how about you? What do you think? How are you doing? Right? So we're creating not a one-off big conversation, but we're just creating a volley. But we're creating an interaction where that person, even if they're defensive and mildly paranoid, they know that we're for them and we're walking alongside them versus judging, versus fixing. We want to practice empathy, not be codependent. We want to, the book of James says, be quick to listen. So if I've got a friend that's really struggling with depression, and they're defensive as all get out, I want to just know my first job is to listen. Like, Gal, you seem, you haven't been out of the home in 2 weeks, and you missed our, you haven't texted back. I'm sad, but how are you doing? I'm fine. I'm good. What are you saying? Oh, nothing. I'm just worried. I love you. I'm for you. I'm concerned, but tell me what's going on for you. So we're always creating an interaction, and we're not trying to fix the situation. Because
do you find more likely than not that they'll just shut down and cut you off?
They will, right? Especially if they're more, under stress. Some of us are fighters, some of us are flighters, some of us create hailstorms, some of us turtle up, right? So for those turtles that just turtle up and go into their shell, they can shut down for a long time because it doesn't feel safe. The other person can just interrogate and fight back and be really argumentative and just really want to shut down the conversation through, levels of rage, if you will. So I just want to make sure that we as Christ followers, when we're walking alongside anybody that we know that's battling a mental health issue, that we're not coming off as their therapist, we're coming off as their friend who loves for them. And we're not trying to fix or educate or parent or manage, but we're walking alongside. And then what we always have to know, Shug, too, is, because once in a while there might be a moment, right, where they might open up a bit and maybe be a little bit vulnerable. We also want to know, like, hey, if I've done any therapy myself, that's the time when I share it. If I know a friend of a friend who's a wonderful counselor, that's the time I say, golly, thanks for being so open. I love you. Thanks for sharing. And, I know a friend of mine has this counselor that really has been helpful. I'm happy to give you his name if you'd like, but whatever you think is best. So we're not putting pressure on ourselves to fix things right away. We're walking alongside them as God does for the rest of their lives.
Those are great tips. And, I know many people who have often felt suicidal that you can ask them, do you or are you considering suicide? And oftentimes they will answer you totally honestly. I used to always think it would be the opposite, that no, I'm not. But then oftentimes they've said, yes, I have thought about it, or I have considered it. And if that's the case, friends, and you don't feel you can turn to someone in your family, or you're not comfortable talking to anybody who's in your close family radius, would you guys do me a favor and just take a moment and write this number down? It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and it's 1-800-273-8255. 1-800-273-8255. And I promise you call, they'll walk alongside you and they'll encourage you as well. There's a teen line that you can also call, teen, and it's 1-800-852-8336. 1-800-852-8336. You're not alone, my friends. And I also would encourage you to reach out to Todd Mulliken, if you would. Todd, ToddMulliken.com. And he would be more than happy to walk with you through these challenging times, whether it be just with yourself as a youth or as a family or as a parent. Just give Todd a call, because he's just such a wealth of information and help. How can we come alongside another parent? Nowadays, Todd, things are so stinking competitive, and there's a lot of mom bashing or comparing. And let's say you have a child that is having mental illness issues, but you don't want to, mental health issues, and you don't want to share that with other people because you're maybe embarrassed, or you're thinking, oh, my friends are going to judge me, etc. How, as a friend, can you come alongside another parent who's battled and having difficulties in the situation with their child?
Well, for sure, we want to make sure we say, if they open up to us, Shug, about their own struggle, we want to first, just listen and validate and walk alongside and make sure it's really safe and they just feel heard and completely listened to. And then it could be a time to say, God, thanks for bringing it up. I've struggled with that myself. Or if they're a really, really, really close friend and you trust them, you could even share, our family has struggled with that a little bit too, right? So that it's really important that there's mutual vulnerability, Shug, because I think sometimes, especially as a person of faith, I remember early in my life, I wouldn't share the issues I would have because I didn't want them to think if you're a Christian, you have issues. Whereas I was totally wrong, I mean, people get closer to Jesus when they know, like, hey, God is comforting us in our affliction, in our pain, and we all have areas of brokenness. So I think it's really important when somebody opens up to us a little bit about their stuff, that we just make them feel heard and listened to, and we share a little bit of our own stuff if we have any, so that they feel not alone in it too.
Mm-hmm. Those are such good words of wisdom. And of course, Scripture has all the wisdom we need. 2 Timothy says, for God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of sound mind. Isaiah 43 says, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I love that. He redeems us. I have called you by name. Friend, he is calling you by your name, and you are mine. Friends, just reach out to Christ and say, I am here. I invite you into my life, and I pray that you will walk with me for the rest of my days. Friends, I love you. This is Shug Burry, HIM4Her Radio, Women's Hot Topics. Todd Mulliken, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom. You guys know I love you. Over and out.